Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our latest webinar in the series, which is titled Remote Working, an Opportunity for Fraud. By way of a brief introduction, my name is Laura and I'm one of the audit partners here at Azets, and I'm really thrilled to be joined by both Martin Chapman and Adam Finch, who will lead you through the webinar over the next hour. Martin is one of our forensic partners here at Azets, and Adam has kindly joined us today from solicitors firm Harrison Clark Rickaby's. We're going to have about an hour for the session today, so we'll look to keep the presentation time to around 30 to 40 minutes and allow enough time for questions and answers at the end. Please do feel free to submit questions throughout the presentation, and they will pop up my end, and I will then field those to the appropriate person at the end. We're also going to have a couple of poll questions today, which will pop up on your screen at the appropriate time, and there'll be around 30 to 40 seconds for you to answer each one, and we'll reveal the results then to the group. On that basis, I'll now kindly pass you over to Martin and Adam.
Thanks, Laura. As Laura mentioned, I'm a forensic accountancy partner here at Azets. I've been doing forensic accountancy for about 16 years now, having a heavy focus on investigations. I've seen most things, probably done over 100 investigations during my career, and looking forward to talking through the seminar with you today. So I'll just let Adam introduce himself.
Thank you, Martin, and thank you to you and Azets for inviting me to speak today. I'm a dispute resolution lawyer specialising in fraud and asset recovery on the civil side. Spent the last probably 20 years dealing with fraud, injunction, civil recovery. I also sit on the steering group committee and the director of Midlands Fraud Forum, which is a non-profit making organisation looking to prevent, detect and pursue recoveries arising from fraud and helping businesses in the Midlands area. Thank you.
Okay, if we could just move on to the next slide. This is what we're going to talk through today, and hopefully, as Laura said, we'll be able to get this done within 40 minutes if I don't waffle on too much. I like talking about this subject. So we'll be talking about remote working and what is the risk with fraud. We'll be looking at what the size of that problem is, why fraud is also committed. Then if you do have a fraud, how you might even go about investigating it. We'll then be handing over to Adam, who will talk through the legal remedies, and then we'll finish on some preventative measures which may help you stop fraud from happening. So if we can move on to the first slide, please. So as Laura mentioned, we've got a couple of polls. So the first poll is, what do you consider to be the biggest fraud risk to you and your organisation? You can vote on this, and you've got about 30 to 40 seconds to do that. So the options are cybercrime, supplier fraud, outside threats such as physical theft, employee fraud, or other. So if you just want to have a vote on that, and then we'll hopefully see what your answers are and whether they kind of fit with what I would expect to see or be something different. Okay, just a little bit longer. Hopefully the results will come up shortly, and we'll be able to see what you've selected and whether it actually fits in with the rest of our presentation. So that's quite good that cybercrime has come out, because it's going to be one of the main areas of what we'll be talking about today. And actually the second one, employee fraud, has also come up, which is the second main area we'll be talking to. So obviously you people who are watching this are already fully aware of what these significant risks are. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. There we go. So with remote working, what is the risk? Well, the first thing is fraud is a risk to everyone, and every one of us and every one of our businesses that we operate. When I started probably looking at fraud a number of years ago, I don't think that was always the case, and people always thought it happened to someone else. But I think organisations and people do realise now that fraud is a risk. But remote working, this new environment we've been in, where we've been forced to work at home or away from the office, what has this meant? Well, there is an increased opportunity for fraud. and principally it revolves around two areas. So increase in cybercrime, which is good that you selected that one, and that increase in employee fraud. But before we go into that real detail and the impact of remote working, we do need to understand two key questions. So if we move on to the next slide, please. So this first question often gets asked, so what enables a fraud to happen? You can see three boxes there. I'm actually going to start in the reverse order. So technology, obviously we're all akin with the term cybercrime, cyber fraud. So technology is used in that. But actually, what is technology in the basis of enabling a fraud to happen? It's an enabler. It still needs something to happen before the fraud can occur. The next one, the middle box, process. The amount of times I've run a fraud at an organisation, they've told me the fraud happened because the process isn't very good. Can you go through our processes and procedures and rewrite our procedures manual? When we start the investigation, we often find that they've got a fantastic procedural manual, but it's sitting in someone's drawer and no one ever refers to it. Because we are creatures of habit, we do a lot of on-the-job training, and we like to have an easy life. So we find shortcuts, and those shortcuts are often what enables a fraud to happen, because we've missed out the key controls to stop that type of fraud from occurring. So it boils down to this first box, people. Unfortunately, we are the weakest link. We're only human. We make mistakes. We don't turn on all the time. We're not always at it. We get things done in a rush, and we do make mistakes. And that's what a fraudster is looking for. He's looking for that human element that we have, where we basically just make an error of judgment or whatever that may be. So people really is what enables a fraud to happen. So if we move on to the next slide. A diagram that I'm hoping many of you have seen before, but if you think about how remote working increases the opportunity for fraud to take place, and you think about this fraud triangle, it really does make sense. So if we take the three corners, the first one being rationalization, so justification of dishonest actions. Interesting first line, stupid people deserve to be cheated. Well, that's an interesting way of thinking about it, but rationalization here could be that you've not been looked after. You felt that the organisation isn't doing what you wanted to do, so you rationalise it by, well, actually, I'm worth more than that to the organisation, so I'm going to take some money from it. I've seen a presentation done by a convicted fraudster, and his rationalisation was he thought the organisation didn't take him seriously. He tried to raise some issues that was ignored, so he went about and committed a fraud. It was actually to highlight an area of weakness. But as the fraud grew and he took more and more money, he realised, actually, this is pretty good. And he started making quite a lot of money from his fraud. But his real rationalisation of the fraud was that he'd been ignored in the organisation. Pressure, so that motivation or an incentive to commit fraud. There is this, some people have an insatiable greed and lust for power and have little moral principles. But the pressure of doing it, obviously, if money is tight, you might have that need to commit that fraud. Then we're on to opportunity, so that ability to actually carry it out. So if you think about the last slide, and we had procedures, if someone understands that a procedure is being bypassed and an element of those controls that have been put in place are not being followed, then that opportunity to commit the fraud exists. And these are things we need to think about when we're thinking about remote working, these three areas and these three corners of the triangle. So if we move on to the next slide. So that first thing which we talked about, cybercrime, well, it's a term that's well used, but what actually is it? So an umbrella term for lots of different types of crime, which either take place online or where technology is a means and target for the attack. But basically just think anywhere where technology can be involved. So what actually does this really mean for us all? Well, cybercrime is the fastest growing fraud in the world. Some of these stats are quite startling. Cybercrime costs the UK economy 15 billion a year. Latest government report puts this at 27 billion per year. Cybercrime is forecast to grow from 3 trillion globally in 2015 to 6 trillion by 2021. Quite frightening, really, when you think about that. And this last one, the one act of fraud or cybercrime is committed every 6 seconds in the UK. That's probably going to be a shorter time frame now with the world we're living in. And hopefully when we move on to the next slide, you'll start seeing some of these things, or you will have seen some of these things, and hopefully not fallen victim to them. So what are we seeing during this remote working period? Well, Cybercrime cases have been on the rise. There's numerous stats about them, and so they reckon anywhere between a 30 to 50% rise in cybercrime during the first lockdown. We haven't seen the stats for the results of the second lockdown that we're in, and obviously we're now going into more tiered restrictions. So again, the remote working is going to continue, so we can only expect cybercrime to continue as fraudsters try to find new ways of committing fraud. So what types are we seeing? There's been so many. There's been so many different areas that we've seen. And the first one, false donation pages. Charities have obviously been under pressure, so people have been putting up false donation pages to take money for people who have been ill, all these types of things. These false texts from HMRC and other agencies, there's an example there, if you've had it come through on your iPhone or phone, about the UK government has issued a payment of £458. It's promised to battle against COVID-19. Please click this link. Obviously, you click that link, you put in some personal details, and lo and behold, a fraud begins to happen. False online sales of PPE, obviously very relevant during the first lockdown, where PPE was obviously a pressure point for everyone, and there was a lot of false websites set up to sell this PPE. COVID-19 update subscriptions. Find out what's happening in the COVID-19 world and join this link, and we'll send you information. And again, you're just giving up your information to a fraudster. Payment by diversion, transferring your money somewhere else. A mandate fraud, asking to change your supplier bank details. The next one, data breach and theft of business IP. I know that when Adam comes to talk, he'll be talking through business IP, but data is so important. I'll touch on data a little bit later as well. Malware, putting malicious software on your system, clicking on a link. So that link might just be to take money from you, but it could be actually to infect your system, to take hold of it. What if ransomware comes in? So you're basically going to have to pay a ransom to release your computer systems. These are things that happen and have happened during remote working. So if we move on to the next slide, please. I think this is the saddest thing in an organisation when it happens. Employee fraud. It's often when I get involved in doing investigations to do with an employee who was taking money from an organisation. It's never nice for that organisation to think that someone they have in a trusted position has taken from them. Often someone who's been there a long time, understands the system, has learned how weaknesses have evolved, probably feels a little bit disgruntled that they've not been looked after. That idea of that convicted fraudster, that was one of his main things, that he didn't think he was looked after of all the time he'd been there and thought he was worth more. I once did an investigation with a senior director who thought he worked really hard, so just decided to pay himself more money. Obviously, that's not what you can actually do. So why is this an issue? So again, if we go back to the fraud triangle and we think of those three corners and we think of rationalisation, so I've been put on reduced hours, or I've not been supported during this period. Opportunity, so there's less scrutiny. I'm working from home, I can get away with what I like. Who's seeing what I'm actually doing? So pressure, money is tight. It's tight for all of us. As a business, we know the pressures that you've been under, but you also think your employees are under the same pressure. They've got bills to pay. So this can really drive new frauds emerging as a result of those new pressure points that we're all having as a result of what's happened in the last few months. But what's the other thing? Well, also as this is going on, those old and existing frauds could be discovered as organisations such as yourself are doing tighter reviews and taking place for finances the system as companies have more time. So you're analysing your data, you're seeing things, and also these old frauds that have been going on for some time start to get discovered. Move on to the next slide, please. So what have we been seeing? So diversion of funds. Well, the opportunity while working from home, working remotely, is everyone really looking at what we're doing. So bank transfers that are intended to suppliers have been sent to personal bank accounts. Check fraud, it still goes on. Who's looking after that checkbook? Check fraud's interesting. That I saw check fraud when I first started, then it disappeared as people stopped using checks. But as people still use some checks, the scrutiny and the controls over checks has really lapsed, and over time, and people can actually exploit that. Expenses fraud. Do you actually know what expenses are going through? What if someone's working from home and they say, oh, I need some more equipment because I can't work from home properly. So they order it, they put it through the expenses, you pay it on trust. Payroll fraud, so false overtime. people obviously working remotely, do you actually always know what they're doing? Yes, we can chat when people have logged on. We can do these types of things, but false overtime claims could easily happen. Collusion with suppliers for contracts, i.e. procurement fraud. When people are in the office, it's always easy to know who they're talking to and what they're doing. People are working from home. They could be using their work email, their personal email, much easier than when they're sitting in the office. Manipulation of results, please don't forget this. A fraud could be not potentially just money going out the door. It could be a fraud where someone has changed their financial outlook to make themselves look better, to give them some justification for their existence while they're in the organisation. Well, the figures look a little bit low in my team. I better put them up. I'll manipulate those figures for a time period to make sure that I stay in my role. That's still fraud. Data theft. Again, I mentioned data. Data to me is one of the key things that fraudsters are looking for. I often read that a fraudster's new currency is data. So where is your data stored is really important. And when people work remotely, can you really control that data as easily as you could when we're all in the office and we're all knew where that data was kept? So if we can move on to the next slide. So to summarize, I suppose, remote working and why does this increase the level of fraud? Well, that less scrutiny that you can do. It's very hard working from home. We've been working from home as an organisation since lockdown. Scrutiny is difficult. It's hard managing people when they're not about. We can do web chats, we can do phone conversation, we can do email, but it's not the same as physically being there and being able to check everything, being able to ask people what they're doing. All these types of things are much harder in remote working. Weaker and harder to manage IT security. I'm sure all your organisations, when you decided remote working was the thing for you, that IT was saying make sure that you're secure, how you get onto your systems, make sure there's firewalls, make sure you've got virus protection, all these types of things. But it's much harder when we're reliant on our own network at home. Concentration and application, is it the same? Is it as easy when you go into the office 9 to 5, you concentrate and then you go home? When you're working from home or you're working remotely, your day does shift around a little bit. From you might start early, you might finish later, you might pick and choose kind of when you're doing things. Is your concentration always there? I don't know. Say you're working, all of a sudden something happens downstairs. You've had one of your children at home, they call for help. You've seen an email, you read it quickly, you click on a link, lo and behold, you've been a victim of cybercrime because you weren't concentrating, your application wasn't quite the same. It's easier to conceal and get away with. Well, is it easier to get away with? I don't know. I mean, I would say yes. You're away from the office, you've got the ability to work probably on your work laptop, a home laptop, all these types of things. You can conceal things, you can move data about. Collusion is easier. You can have conversations that your bosses don't know you're having. It's much easier to collude with people when you're not seen and not visible. And that last one, which I did touch on before, your justification of existence. So if we move on to the next slide. So unfortunately, you fallen victim to a fraud, then you need to go and investigate it, or you want to investigate it. What do you need to consider? Now, that first thing is always the biggest thing for me, objective. If you don't know what your objective is in this investigation, it makes it very hard for any professional to come and assist you. Do you just want to remove an individual? Do you want to find out what the problem is? Do you want to make that problem better and go away? Or do you want some punishment, civil, criminal, whatever that may be, will really change how the investigations run. But it doesn't mean if you start with one objective, you can't change. I've got a case at the minute where we've changed objectives. I think this is the 3rd time now. But the case has always progressed in the way that we knew what those objectives were. Planning, vital at all stages, which is quite obvious, but it really is with an investigation. And who? Make sure you have the staff that you have 2 groups. You have the ones who want to know what's going on when a fraud happens, and you have the ones who need to know. It's better to have the need to know. The want to know, yeah, they want to know, but they don't need to. So just keep those out the loop. The less people who know that investigation's going on, the better. Resources, do you have the staff, physical or technological resources to carry on? Skill set, have you got the right people involved? Time, how time critical is something? Does the subject need to know? Is there tipping off? How critical is this? An investigation does not have to happen immediately. There's certain things you want to do. You want to have an objective, you want to have your planning, but it doesn't mean you have to go full-blown into an investigation and start doing things that can cause issues going on. Logistics, so important now. 2 cases that I'm working on at the minute, I've had remote and in-person interviews, very different, very difficult to do, but you need to think about those logistics. Can you go on site? Can you get those records that you normally would? Preserving evidence, again, remote working makes this harder, but email records, so important, computer records. What about your physical evidence? If you're in a regulated environment, when do you need to notify? Insurance, please do not forget this. Insurers, do you have fraud cover? You may do. It may help on recoverability professional fees. Police, when do we notify? Do we need to notify? Can we run our own investigation, then get the police involved? I know it's something that Adam will be looking at when he's talking about criminal and civil. What laws, compliance and regulations do you have to follow? If you're going to interview someone under caution, do you know how to do it? Do you know what you should be doing with your regulator? And the last one, action fraud, an organisation set up really to assist and filter through fraud cases and also provide fraud stats. When do you need to do it and how? I'd just quickly like to just ask Adam a question on action fraud, because it's something that gets talked about a lot when I talk to clients about action fraud and is it worth doing? So Adam, what do you think? Do you think it is worth reporting a fraud to action fraud?
Thank you, Martin. Yeah, there's been a number of misconceptions around action fraud and as to what exactly it does. If you're looking to go down the criminal route, you'll have no option but to report to action fraud in the first instance. But don't necessarily assume anything will be done once you made a report. But it is important to put a report into action fraud, if nothing else, just to have that notified and recorded, even if nothing else happens with that report.
Okay, I mean, I think the thing I found with action fraud, the most use is the reporting is because we get some stats out of it at the end of the day. How reliable those stats are, they're always slightly lower than they should be because not everyone reports it, but at least we get some information from it, I suppose. Is probably sounds a bit of a terrible answer that an organisation has been set up to help, and I'm saying it's used as a stat sheet for me, but that's how sometimes I do feel. But thank you for that, Adam. If we could move on to the next slide. So then what does a typical investigation look like? This is a typical flow chart of what an investigation may look like, but you will swing back and forth, you will add more areas. It's always really hard. I often get asked, well, how much is this investigation going to cost me and how long will it take? And all we can really ever do is tell you what the front bit will be, the fact-finding bit. We might be able to tell you what interviewing a whistleblower may be, and we might be able to tell you how much it's going to cost to write a report and how long that will take. The bit in the middle is the bit that makes an investigation interesting for me. It changes. One direction you go in changes. One door opens and another door shuts. It really does change and very rapid. And I said a couple of cases I've got at the moment, the objectives change, so that means the process has changed. Things we've been doing has been different. But if you think about what it would look like, so you assess what that allegation is, what that issue is, you secure and preserve that evidence, you make some plan and you do some fact finding around what that would look like. You might have to do some initial meetings, think of a witness meeting, just gathering information from someone with their cooperation. You'll get information that you'll test and analyze. You'll then have to interpret it. Then you might get to the most interesting part for me, which is interviewing the subject. That could be under caution, it could be for HR reasons, but the person that's committed the fraud, if you can get to that person. Obviously in a cybercrime, you'll probably never get to that person. Then drafting a report, we might be presenting our findings, and then finalising and handing over. And who are we handing over to? Again, depending on what objective we got from this investigation. If you just go to the next slide, I think that's the first part finished for me. I'm now going to hand over to Adam, who's going to talk through the legal remedies you can do if you do suffer a fraud. Thanks.
Thank you, Martin. Yeah, just touching on what you do if you are a victim of fraud, whether it's cybercrime enabled or employee enabled. Some of these points Martin just touched on as well, but I can't stress how important it is to identify what your objectives are. That will dictate then your immediate next steps in understanding your priorities. If you're engaging professionals externally, it will help drive that framework and how to investigate that particular fraud and how you gather that evidence. It's also crucial that you identify a core team in order to carry out that investigation of the fraud itself, to collation of the evidence, preserving that evidence. Last thing you want to do is tamper with that evidence that could then give problems later down the line in respect of reliability. As such, quite often we'll look at instructing specialist IT forensic investigators to come along and image the IT devices so we can work from the images rather than the original data sets. Similarly, by having a tight team, we can look to preserve litigation privilege. The last thing we want to do is inadvertently waive that privilege by providing disclosure of spreadsheets, investigation reports, Martin's report, for example, to the fraudster at all or at an early stage. By keeping a tight team, we can try and preserve privilege in itself. I'd probably spend the rest of today just talking about privilege and lose all of the audience on that. But if you do have questions about preservation of privilege, then do let me know separately. What evidence is available will then help determine how you proceed, if at all. Sometimes, if you're unable to collate the evidence in place to prove your suspicions, it might be that there's very little you can do apart from take steps internally to tighten the processes, the policies, the procedures, etc., which Martin and I have both come on to separately. If you do have the evidence available, the options you can look at are either civil or criminal proceedings, and both have their advantages and disadvantages from that perspective. If I may, next slide, please. Looking at criminal proceedings, it is an obvious one, and it's one we'll consider with all of our clients where they've been a victim of fraud, irrespective of the type of fraud, and invariably, I say there's little to lose by notifying action fraud. Whether or not we want a criminal investigation to proceed, we'll consider that separately. But in any criminal proceedings, if it leads to a successful conviction, then it does send a very strong message to your stakeholders, whether that's a message to other employees who may have temptations, to your customers, your suppliers, your stakeholders, your shareholders. From that perspective, the business will not tolerate being a victim of fraud. It clearly also helps to protect your brand, your reputation. Because the police carry out the investigation and then the CPS leads the prosecution, it is generally a lower cost option compared to civil recovery. Invariably, there are downsides to that. You lose control. It's up to the police, the CPS, to decide who to investigate, when, how quickly they move, and that will be dependent on the resources available. Another frustrating element is there is no guarantee that any investigation will commence. That's completely outside of your control, although it should be a victim-led investigation. That's not always the case. We ran a conference for the Midlands Fraud Forum not that long ago, where the Chief Inspector of West Midland Police stood up in front of the business community to say they did not have resources to investigate business crime. You can see the ripple effects that had on the audience and the repercussions of that. The chap has just been very candid, very honest about the situation and having his hands tied as to the lack of resources being available. Convictions can take several years. Quite often 2 to 3 years even for simple frauds. If it leads to conviction, for fraud in particular, the judge can sentence up to 10 years. For serious frauds, it's generally 4 to 7 years. So they can have a very serious impact on the individuals concerned. The other aspect or the downside of criminal prosecutions is not only can you guarantee whether there will be a conviction, but even if there is a conviction, whether the judge is minded to order any additional elements such as a confiscation order or compensation order, or look at proceeds of crime recovery. Next slide, please. Quite often the alternative for consideration is a civil recovery route against that fraudster. Again, the advantages is you take ownership, you decide who to pursue, what causes of action you want to bring, and that has a bearing on aspects such as insurance. If you're looking at an errant director or a professional who's misappropriated your assets, they may have insurance in place. More often than not, the likes of professional indemnity insurance or directors and officers insurance doesn't generally cover the individual's fraud. It does cover mistakes, negligence, etc. So there may be grounds of not looking to plead fraud or deceit, and rather simply rely on negligence, breach of care, breach of directive duties to preserve that insurance. In respect of civil recovery, we can move very quickly. I think one of the quickest injunctions we've obtained on behalf of our clients is within 36-48 hours. The courts are geared up for urgent applications. Ideally, they and we do prefer to have more time. If you're looking at assets going AWOL and being dissipated by the fraudster, in particular monies or intellectual property, then you do need to move very quickly. Again, civil recovery of judgment, court order does send a strong message to the fraudsters concerned, but the downside is it can be very costly, injunctions in particular. Whilst if we're successful, we would look to recover the majority of those costs back. Again, it's still a burden to bear, and likewise supporting any action, but civil action in particular, does take quite a lot of time. We will need help collating the evidence, supporting drafting witness statements, and providing instructions throughout. Next slide, please. So in respect of civil route, I am slightly biased being a civil litigator, but we will always look at the criminal route in each and every case. So the most common option, although one of the hardest to obtain, is an injunction. These do affect the civil rights of the fraudster at a very early stage in the proceedings. The judge is being asked to make a powerful decision that has wide-ranging impact, certainly, for example, a freezing injunction, where you are freezing the assets of the defendant concerned in order to preserve the status quo. As such, the judge needs to be persuaded there is a good arguable case for the defendant to answer. He doesn't or she doesn't carry out a full review of the evidence at that stage. This is quite often a half a day or a day's determination in order to grant that freezing injunction. Quite often we're asked to look at search orders and delivery up of IT equipment, more and more nowadays, where we're looking at theft of confidential data or IP in particular, and that's where we'll go in with a supervising solicitor there to explain the terms of the order to the individual or business concerned, to explain that they're required to hand over, for example, IT equipment to enable us to image and carry out searches. Again, that can be very helpful in getting to the heart of where your assets has been taken and what's happened to those. So, for example, we acted on behalf of an insurance company a few years ago in which their customer database for critical illness health was misappropriated by an IT consultant. That contained very sensitive data involving their health-related issues. They moved very quickly. We obtained an injunction requiring the delivery up of all IT devices held by the individual at his home. So it's very intrusive. We had independent people searching the house, taking away all IT equipment that could hold data, TVs, cameras, phones, as well as the usual mobile phones and laptops, etc. From that, we found out what happened to our client's database. We could delete that and retrieve it. We also found out he'd done the same to another insurance company a few years previous. So we obtained a court order permitting us to report that to the other insurance company and also to the regulator. Civil recovery also allows us to trace assets. So if the individual fraudsters pass those assets on to another party, connected individual, it allows us to follow those assets. And quite often we'll seek disclosure against connected parties, innocent and been caught up in all of the fraud. For example, banks, in order to understand what's happened, say, to money that's been dissipated. We have in the past obtained court orders against police forces in order to obtain a copy of their file where they've decided not to proceed with a prosecution. And more often than not, they will cooperate with such an order as long as it's been granted by the judge. As I mentioned, injunctions are a very powerful tool and made at quite an early stage of the case. So any evidence needs to be sworn on oath by way of an affidavit. And then the claimant has to provide what's called a cross undertaking in damages. That means if that injunction has been incorrectly granted, then at a later stage, the judge can make an order for compensation to the defendant. Of all the years of injuncting, only one time I can recall a client's been asked to pay out under the cross undertaking damages. We were pursuing an individual taking a large sum of our client's money, relying on data from an investigator confirming the individual was at home. After half an hour being ignored to serve the terms of the injunction on that individual, we went back to the judge, who granted an order for the door to be kicked down and we can have forcible entry. Unfortunately, it wasn't my size 10s, we had to use the local police force, but it turned out that the individual had these automatic dimmer switches just to show that it looked like someone was at home. In due course, we were successful in recovering our client's assets, but my client was required to pay for a new door. In the scheme of things, that was okay. The advantage as well with civil route is that one can bring a large number of claims, in particular fraudulent misrepresentation, deceit, unjust enrichment, and then the more typical ones, breach of duties, directed duties, breach of contract. So it does give you a variety, depending on the circumstances and the evidence available. Next slide, please. The final option, a third way, as it were, is private prosecutions, and these are becoming increasingly common. This enables the individual, the business, as the claimant, in order to bring a prosecution against a fraudster. Again, the advantages here, they are often quicker than CPS-led prosecutions, more focused, you have that control. The downside is disclosure obligations are high in respect to criminal prosecutions, and you will still have to jump through those. Similarly, the Crown can at any point take over the control of any prosecution, but it is an option available. Next slide. Thank you. We are seeing an increase of theft of intellectual property. It's more readily cyber enabled from that perspective, and it's one we're encouraging all businesses to take a close look at the IP they have within their organization. As it's an intangible asset, it's very easy to port, to move, to copy, to steal, whether it's your patents, your trademarks, confidential data in particular. It's very easy for employees to take to a rival competing business. And once that IP has been stolen, it's quite difficult to A, trace, and B, recover. So from that perspective, it's crucial, if you can, to take steps now in order to protect your intellectual property. Next slide, please. There are a number of steps you can take within your organisation to try and protect the intellectual property. And it's a worthwhile exercise, not only to reduce the opportunity for theft and fraud, but actually it has a tangible value as an ongoing asset, and carrying out a full review may help realise that opportunity. But certainly as a key starting position, where possible, ensure that you have registered trademarks and patents, and that you keep proof of registration. It can take a couple of years to obtain a patent registration. There are fast track options available, but they still take time. So ensure you keep a careful log of any steps taken in order to register any IP, and keep that very tight within your organisation. Similarly, look to ensure you protect your intellectual property rights in any contracts, whether it's with suppliers, clients, customers, and also protection within the employment contracts. Train staff on looking at phishing and clickbait emails. We're even getting phishing emails reportedly coming from the Intellectual Property Office, which is somewhat ironic given the context that I'm discussing now. So do take care within your organisation. I know Martin's touched on this, and you probably will do again. Look at quality malware software. Ensure your IT team is developing and updating the software on a regular basis. If in doubt, look to outsource. In addition, as your marketing team, they're probably better placed than the IT team to regularly look at social media, and also search engines, just to see whether your IP is being infringed from that perspective. And then ensure copyright and other IP notices are contained within your literature as well. It won't prevent the theft, but it's more likely to help reduce that theft. Thank you. Next slide. Just turning to a recent case by way of a study. Certainly we found it quite interesting. It was quite novel, one of the first of its kind. We acted for a recruitment agency client. Invariably, as most of probably you all know, the staff spend a huge number of hours on LinkedIn in mining information around candidates and customers. One individual joined a competing recruitment agency and decided to reconnect with all his connections on LinkedIn. He had several thousand connections, and he went down the route of direct contacting those he wanted to. He also sent targeted updates and then provided generic postings about his move, about what he's up to, and what the new business can do for those individuals. Our client clearly wanted to take steps, but understood that LinkedIn was not as straightforward as if the individual had downloaded a copy of the database, which was a typical pattern we regularly see. Their client did have the usual post-termination restrictions in place, but is reaching out to someone on LinkedIn solicitation. And it's a good question that's not been fully tested until fairly recently. Our client also helpfully, because LinkedIn was such a core part of their business, had a social media policy in place where the employee was required to waive their rights to LinkedIn connections. It's not that common, but we are advising and recommending social media policies more and more from that perspective. We obtained an injunction on behalf of our client against a former employee. Unhelpfully, the judge had not heard of LinkedIn, let alone used LinkedIn, but he did understand the concept that this was a database that our client had spent a considerable amount of resources in developing. The employees probably spent 2/3 of his day on that database on LinkedIn every day. Our client paid for an enhanced user license, and it also had a social media policy in place. We obtained an order permitting us to delete all connections made during the period of employment. Those made prior to employment, post-employment, and made personally were retained by the individual. So it was a complicated order and took some time to formalise in order to satisfy the judge's terms as to what we could delete. We also retained a copy for our client. Our client recognises that the individual can readily reconnect, but it just slows that process down. As I say, it's quite unusual. LinkedIn were not terribly enamored about the process as they view it as an individual account, but here we have measures in place to have that protection. Next slide, please. And finally, just some practical steps. If social media and confidential data is a core part of your business, then do look to see what you can do to mitigate the position of an employee taking that information to a competitor. Look at how confidential information is accessed, in particular what devices I use. Is it necessary for that individual to access that confidential information? Certainly a big one we encourage is not to allow or permit personal devices for work purposes. In particular, we have clients coming to us where employees are allowed to use their own personal mobile phones, and it's quite hard to police the deletion of data of those mobile phones, and when they land in the new role, they will have instant access to customers and suppliers, etc. Likewise, at any exit, ensure all property is returned and have a look if they have been using personal devices. Reiterate restrictive covenants and follow that up. If you have any suspicions, do not hesitate to mine email accounts and servers for the last few months leading up to their termination in order to ascertain whether any suspicions could be correct. If you do come across any issues, then look to instruct experts very quickly. Quite often when we get involved, we may look at IT forensics to come along and help image the data. Very importantly, look to reach out to your customers, your suppliers, to redevelop those relationships that are close to the departing employee. If it's appropriate, ask all new employees and potentially existing employees, although that's a lot more difficult, to look at creating new LinkedIn or social media accounts at the start of their employment, and consider a social media waiver. Thank you. And I'll hand back to Martin.
Thank you for that, Adam, and the points you raised, obviously some really interesting points there about which route you take once a fraud has been discovered, and some of the issues that sit around that. I'm just going to briefly just touch upon a few preventative measures which Adam has already touched on, but if you think of cybersecurity, think about defence in depth, and there's many layers to it. I mean, data, talk about the crown jewels, what your assets and key information that you need to protect are. Think about your files and data, and where it's held and how to protect that. Software, have you got software that enables you to restrict the malware, to develop securely, use the cloud? Platform, building its resilience. Think about the end user divisor. What about if you bring your own device? Network, ensure that you're up to date, securely configured and patched. Again, these are things that are more complex that we're in remote working. Users, educate and tolerate, encourage that reporting. Physical, if we're in lockdown but offices are still open, how protected are our offices while we're not there, or our warehouses, and all these things where we probably had a number of people walking around, that's still got some physical security that you need to protect. Anticipate, so do you actually know if you had to restore your backup, it would actually work? Test it, make sure it does work. There's no point in taking backups if you do have a failure and then you go to retrieve from your backup and it doesn't actually work, you can't restore it. Some really good guidance if you go on the National Cybersecurity Centre website, the web page is just listed there, and that runs through some of these top tips on cybersecurity. So if we move on to the next slide, please. This is our second and last poll, and I'd just like you to all spend some time answering this one. And the question is, what do you think is the best preventative measure for employee fraud? Again, you're going to have about 40 seconds to do that. So the options are a culture of punishment, whistleblowing, data analysis, your internal controls, internal audit, or your statutory external audit. So if you can just think about what is that best preventative measure for that employee fraud. We'll give you a few more seconds on this one, and then we'll see what answer people pick for this one. Okay, just a couple more seconds. Hopefully the answers will come up shortly. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how this matches up to what I'm about to talk about. Right, let's just have a look what people have said on that. Well, we've got 5% who think a culture of punishment is there. Internal audit, which is often the one that I often have always got work from our internal audit team, have given us work from the back of that. Culture of punishment is interesting. You think it's going to be the wrong answer. I did a couple of cases for a well-known, I suppose, vacuum clean supplier who still runs the organisation, very much in control of it. And if you crossed him, he would punish you, and he would tell everyone that he'd punish you. So it was well known that if you went to the whistleblowing route and then a case happened, he would go all the way through proceedings. And we ended up two cases that went through civil proceedings, bankrupted families, took money off them, spent more money recovering the money that was taken, but publicised what happened if you did cross him. So an interesting thought, and let's just move on to the next slide. So prevention. So my top tip was always whistleblowing, and I think it's still up there with the best. Your staff are your eyes and ears. They know your organisation better than you do. But you need a strong and accessible policy. You need to train and evaluate those whistleblowers, and a culture of openness and trust. But remote working certainly makes this harder, without a shadow of a doubt. Whistleblowers, are they know more about the business now? Are they far removed from it? Is it easy to report? All these things make whistleblowing slightly harder than it was before we went to remote working. We move on to the next slide, please. So with a prevention tip, so know those areas of risk and make sure you do profile them. Know where your key assets are and what protects them. So cash, bank fund, data, your IP. If you have policies, so you produce them, but test them and retest them, change them. Over time, things change. Someone who works in the organization might actually find a shortcut to do something, but actually you can use that shortcut, but as long as you still put preventative measures and controls in place. Train your staff. If your staff aren't trained on understanding fraud risk, then you're always going to be potentially a victim to it. Use your data to analyze patterns. So I've left there, to me, data now is your biggest help with remote working. If you can control your data, you understand it, and you can analyze it, it may help you identify fraud. So what does that look like? So you might be able to analyze your change of bank details. Has a supplier detail bank changed? Does it match to someone who's an employee? Do you keep leaving and joiners records? What about your holiday records? You've got the data, use it to help you prevent fraud from happening. So if we move on, the next slide, which I think now will be hopefully some questions, and thank you for listening to myself and Adam. Again, thank you, Adam, for presenting on the legal remedies. It's massively important. So I'm going to hand over to Laura to see if we've had any questions. And again, thank you for listening to us.
Well, as I said, any questions that remain unanswered, we will share between Adam and Martin and answer those directly. And we've had quite a number of people ask questions over whether we will share the slides. So that will happen as part of our procedures anyway. We'll send a recording and the slides over within the next week or so. And also just a reminder of our upcoming webinars. We've got our final one in the series on the 10th of December. So please do register your interest in that. And I look forward to hopefully seeing you on that one. Thanks again, Martin and Adam.
Okay, thanks all.